PS4 and PS5 video. So we are now 1 year on since my state of jailbreak video for the PS5, which I did in January of last year, 2025, and I thought it would be interesting just to do this every year, just kind of do a catch-up every year to see how far things have improved with the state of jailbreaking the PS4 and PS5 1 year on. So every year, we will kind of come back and see how things have progressed over the year and what we can now achieve with our jailbroken PS4s and PS5s compared to last year. So we can kind of document the progress of the jailbreak over the years. So that is the general idea with this video, just to kind of compare and contrast how far things have come in a year. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive straight into this. So first off, it's important to mention, of course, that when it comes to jailbreaking the PS4 and the PS5, it typically requires 2 exploits to be chained together. That's a userland exploit, which is just the entry point to be able to escape the app sandbox and reach deeper into the system code. And then we also need a kernel exploit, which actually jailbreaks the console in the first place, but normally that kernel code cannot be reached without the userland exploit, so we have to chain the userland exploit and the kernel exploit together to be able to jailbreak the console. That is typically how most of the jailbreaks are done with the PS4 and the PS5. Now, the PS4 hasn't really changed much in terms of what you can do with the jailbreak, as it was already a pretty well mature jailbreak by this time last year. However, what has changed is the method of jailbreaking and what firmwares are actually jailbreakable. So this time last year, the latest jailbreak we had was known as the PP-Poon jailbreak from the Flow, which was a standalone kernel exploit, actually did not require a userland exploit to trigger it, but it did have to be triggered using another device like a computer, phone, or Raspberry Pi to run the exploit, as I had to send certain PPPoE network data to the console to jailbreak it, and you could use this to jailbreak up to firmware 11.0. That was the highest jailbreakable firmware at the time. Since then, we've seen a new Blu-ray userland exploits compatible up to firmware 12.52, and a new userland exploits that uses the PlayStation Vue application, which is compatible up to firmware 13.04. We also have 2 new kernel exploits, the lapped kernel exploit, which works up to firmware 12.02, and just the most stable of the 2. Then we have the poopsploit or net control exploits that's compatible up to firmware 13.0 on the PS4. Now we can chain this kernel exploit with the PS Vue userland exploit to jailbreak up to 13.0, and this is the latest jailbreak for the PS4, which can be used up to firmware 13.0. It does have one downside, which is that it requires a network connection to run the jailbreak, but if you jailbreak the PS4 once with PlayStation Vue, you can then use that jailbreak to unpatch the Blu-ray jailbreak on 13.0, so that you will then be able to jailbreak using a Blu-ray disc from that point on, which is completely offline. So there is a path to getting a completely offline jailbreak with this setup if you want to go down that route, but otherwise you can just go ahead and use the network connection with PlayStation Vue to jailbreak the console. It is a remarkably fast jailbreak. So those are the pros and cons of both options, and that's the state of the PS4 jailbreak at the moment, being able to jailbreak with an application up to firmware 13.0. So that's the situation with the PlayStation 4. So moving on to the PlayStation 5, which has seen the biggest change by far, as the PS5 has gone through some dramatic improvements over the past year. Now, this time last year, we had 3 userland exploits: the WebKit userland exploit PS3 that only worked up to firmware 5.50, a Blu-ray exploit that worked up to firmware 7.61, and a Lua save game exploit, which still works up to the latest PS5 firmwares today. And we had 2 kernel exploits: the IPv6 kernel exploit working up to 4.51, and a UMTX kernel exploit that worked up to firmware 7.61. So 1 year on, and things are looking a hell of a lot better. So many new userland exploits have come out, like the Y2JB, using the YouTube app as the entry point, Netflix and Hack, which uses the Netflix application, and the YARP exploit, which uses a game, Arcade Spirits and New Challengers, with a save game exploit, and another save-based exploit to LuaCore, which uses the game Star Wars Racer Revenge. Not only that, but we also have the same kernel exploits as the PS4, with the lapse kernel exploits working up to firmware 10.1 on the PS5, and the poopsploit working up to firmware 12.0. So we can jailbreak with the YouTube application up to firmware 10.1 using the lapse kernel exploit, which is as simple as just loading the YouTube application on your console and waiting for it to jailbreak. So it's a very convenient jailbreak to use now, up to firmware 10.1. However, we can only load the Poops kernel exploits from compatible userland exploits like WebKit's Blu-ray and LuaCore. This makes it extremely limiting, with the only game that can be used to load it being Star Wars Racer Revenge, which was already a rare game before it could be used to jailbreak the PS5. This has caused prices of this game to skyrocket, making this jailbreak unobtainable to many. It uses a JIT exploit based on MaestroCore called LuaCore as the userland exploit, and the Poops kernel exploits to jailbreak the console. Just like PS4, you can also unpatch the Blu-ray exploit once you get the jailbreak loaded, so that the console can be jailbroken from a Blu-ray disc from then on. Because of this, we're already seeing Blu-ray and patching services pop up, where you can send a PS5 to someone who has the Star Wars game, and they will be able to unpatch the Blu-ray exploit on your console, and then send your console back with a Blu-ray disc that you can use to jailbreak it from then on. So that is something that we're starting to see appear for those higher firmwares. Now, the PS5 also has a hypervisor which restricts access to the kernel, which limits the capabilities of the jailbreak. With PS5, we need userland kernel and some kind of exploit or workaround for the hypervisor as well. So let's see where we are compared to last year. These are the slides from my 2025 State of Jailbreak video from January. We had a hypervisor exploit from 1.0 to 2.70 called Bipervisor, but we had low game compatibility since the firmware was so old that most PS5 games would require a higher firmware to be able to run them, so you couldn't really run most PS5 games on those older firmwares, and we were not any closer to getting Linux support for the PS5 at that time to be able to make use of that hypervisor exploit. Now on 3.0 to 4.51, we had a jailbreak without a hypervisor exploit using something called kstuff, which is a workaround for the hypervisor that allows almost full jailbreak capabilities, but does have some downsides like performance impacts when running games, frame starters lag and longer loading times, and of course not able to run Linux when it comes out. 5.0 to 5.50, we had the userland and kernel implementation loaded from the web browser, but we did not have kstuff support yet, so it was extremely limited. However, by April 2025, we did have kstuff support up to 5.50 at that time, but as of January, when the slides were made, we did not have access to that at that time. 6.0 to 7.61 could only be jailbroken with a Blu-ray disc, which required a disc edition console, and we didn't have kstuff support at that time either, or any jailbreak support really implemented yet up to those firmwares, leaving 4.51 as the highest firmware with a workable jailbreak, and 7.61 being the highest firmware that was technically jailbreakable, but still needed a lot of work at the time. Now, how has this picture changed as of April 2026? Well, we now have a hypervisor exploit working up to firmware 4.51, meaning a full jailbreak with the ability to load Linux once it's released. Now, I'm technically cheating a little bit here, as at the time of recording this video, the hypervisor exploit is not yet released, but it is being tested and confirmed to work up to 4.51, and it's just going through the final tweaks to make it compatible to load Linux on the PS5 once that also releases, and that is also very close, it looks like, to a release as well. 5.0 to 5.50 can still jailbreak with the web browser, but without a hypervisor exploit, it is using kstuff, which is now fully supported on those firmwares, but it is unlikely to get Linux support. 6.0 to 10.01, that's a lot of firmwares within that range. Those firmwares can jailbreak using the YouTube application now, which works on digital and disc edition consoles, so no need for a Blu-ray disc requiring a disc edition console on those firmwares, with full kstuff support, so everything is supported up to firmware 10.01, minus Linux support, of course, because we don't have a hypervisor exploit for these firmwares yet. 10.20 to 12.0 can only be truly jailbroken with the Star Wars Racer Revenge game, which is unaffordable for now, but does have full kstuff support, so if you were lucky enough to get that game on that firmware, you can enjoy full kstuff support, and of course you could also get the Blu-ray drive exploit unpatched to be able to use that to jailbreak up to 12.0 also, if you took advantage of one of those Blu-ray and patching services, for example. So that is the general idea. We can now jailbreak all the way up to 12.0, whereas previously we could only properly jailbreak up to 4.51 as of January 2025. So from a year and a few months, we're now able to go from 4.51 all the way up to 12.0 being the latest jailbreakable firmware, 10.1 being the latest jailbreak that is actually usable for most people, because of course you can use the YouTube application. It doesn't require any Blu-ray discs or games that you need to get to be able to jailbreak. So up to 10.01, that's the most convenient jailbreak to use on the PS5 right now. And if you're on an older firmware up to 4.51, you have the added bonus of being able to run Linux once that releases as well, and it's looking like that should be fairly soon too. So yeah, anyway, it'll be interesting to come back in a year's time to see how things have evolved compared to where we are now. And we also had lots of issues with the jailbreak from last year that have now been resolved with new features added. So most of these should be reserved for a more in-depth video, like a what you can do with a jailbroken PS5 video, which I will likely make fairly soon. But here are the highlights. PS5 game backups had many issues last year with the majority of games not being playable at all, and for the ones that did work, they would often need to be loaded from USB storage, as they wouldn't load correctly from the internal console storage. We also didn't have proper backports to be able to run newer games on older firmwares, so people left on those older firmwares would get left behind in terms of the games that they could run. Now this has thankfully all been more or less completely resolved at this point. Almost all PS5 games that have been dumped are now working fully, and the vast majority of them also run fine from the internal storage. We also recently got proper backports with a new backport payload that is making newer games that require firmwares as high as 9.x or 10.1 able to be loaded on much older firmwares like 4.0 and 4.03. Lastly, we have performance improvements, as one of the issues from this time last year was that any game dumps that you run would often have lag or stutters in certain areas and much longer loading times. This was partly due to KStuff running in the background, which is needed to launch your game backups. This has been solved by disabling KStuff once the game is loaded to claw back some of that performance to help keep games running smoothly and load faster. Now, last year we had an issue where PS4 DLC did not work on fake package PS4 games unless it was manually patched into the executable, which was a hassle, but this has also been resolved, so DLC now works normally on your PS4 games thanks to an update to KStuff that solved that issue. And also remote play, built-in cheats, and patches are now available from within ETA Hen, making it much easier to apply cheats patches and enable remote play access to your console, as built-in cheats can be enabled when you're running the game. You can be inside a game and then just hit a certain controller shortcut on your controller to bring up the cheats menu, and then you can enable and disable certain cheats for your games, and then press circle to go back into your game with those cheats enabled. It is super simple. And then also for patches, there is now a plugin that gets installed when you load items flow. You can enable that plugin and then apply the patches in-game. So that's all now available in a more convenient package on the PS5. And last year, we only had the ability to manipulate PS4 saves on the PS5 in a very limited capacity. Well, now we have something called the Garlic Save Manager, which allows us to fully modify our save files for PS4 saves and PS5 saves. We can import, export, encrypt, decrypt, and re-sign our save files for PS4 and PS5 games now, so you can fully manipulate your save files on the PS5, which was not possible this time last year. So anyway, those are just a few of the big improvements made to the PS5 in 1 year. Of course, there are other smaller changes that have also been added, and again, I'll probably make a full what you can do with a jailbroken PS5 video in the near future, but for now, that's how things have progressed so far. So it'll be interesting to come back in 1 year's time to see how things have progressed from here. So anyway, that's going to do it for this video. So once again, hope you guys enjoyed this video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And as always, I will